Okay, so I'm also going to hand out a quiz review, which is not to be graded, but we're going to go over the answers. So you're going to keep this and not turn it in. Thank you. Because I don't have 20. New. Okay, so maybe the printer ran out of paper.
Yeah, no, you turn it on that way. You pull it down and turn it on. Or that one's not. And all, it's on. And all I'm gonna do is hit the red button. Sure. And you have to put a light on it. A girl. I can get it. I'm happy to work. I'm happy to take them. So good.
Okay, sorry, I don't know why I reached out already. So the 10 instead of 20.
Probably should go just for pressure.
Okay, so when looking at the chemical reaction below, you need to think reduction and oxidation, and what was the mnemonic device that we used? Oil rig. So is NADH losing a hydrogen or is it gaining a hydrogen as that chemical reaction proceeds? It's losing. So it is being oxidized. Oxidation is losing, reduction is gaining. Okay. So the chemical reaction below or above, and notice that chemical reaction has pyruvic acid, but that's the same thing as pyruvate. So don't get confused. Pyruvate and pyruvic acid are the same thing, okay? So when it is being broken down and producing lactic acid, what is that? Fermentation, right? So think about yogurts, right? Yogurt, there's bacteria in yogurt that take apart the milk and they produce lactic acid as the byproduct, right? Lactobacilli, okay? What is the end product of cellular respiration? So we can look at this diagram right here where pyruvate or pyruvic acid comes in. So what is the end product? Carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, okay? So oxygen is the end product of photosynthesis, but cellular respiration is carbon dioxide, okay? The electron transport chain. So let's look at a diagram of the electron transport chain. Remember that this is in the inner membrane of the mitochondria, so the cristae, and you see these proteins are transferring electrons, and it's a chain of proteins that do that. And so what is their function?
To pump the hydrogen out of the inner membrane.
Yes, excellent. So they use that electrical energy to build up an electrochemical gradient. So now we have the potential energy stored, right? And so when you look at this, the next question, the citric acid cycle, which is also called the Krebs cycle, does it occur in the cytoplasm of the cell? No. It occurs in the mitochondria. Does it require oxygen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So here's the chemical reaction, right? It's requiring oxygen right here. We combine the hydrogen ions with oxygen to produce water. Okay. Does it use pyruvate as a starting molecule? Yes. So the correct answer would be D. Right? It requires oxygen and uses pyruvate. Okay. So this is the ATP synthase molecule. This is the molecule that we watched the video on. Remember that this is a motor molecule, which is kind of cool. So the movement of the hydrogen ions through it actually turns it, and then that turning is turned into energy where ADP is converted to ATP. Okay. So what is it uses hydrogen ions, right? So that's A is correct. Is it an example of an enzyme?
Yes.
Yes, because remember that anytime you see that ACE ending, ATP synthase, that's an enzyme. Is it found in the cristae membrane of the mitochondria?
Yes.
Yes. Is it a protein?
Yes.
Yes. So the correct answer is all of the above. Okay. How about the image? So thinking about in lab, what did you see that looked like this? Bone is the correct answer. Yes. So remember, a compact bone is the solid part of your bone. It's not the inner part of the bone. Okay. The tissue is lining the trachea, and what do you remember it called? A, right? Pseudostratified columnar. So it's column shaped and it looks stratified, but it isn't. And one reason that it looks stratified is the nuclei, but also what type of cell produces the mucus? Goblet cells, right? So the goblet cells produce the mucus, so they're also in that epithelial tissue, and glands are derived from epithelial tissue, so that makes sense. Okay. Endocrine glands. Now this is versus what other type of gland do you have? Exocrine. Okay, so endocrine glands, do they produce hormones?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Are they classified as epithelial tissue?
Yes.
Yes. Do they do not use ducts to release their products? They do not use ducts, right? So the correct answer was all of the above. So endocrine glands, like the pituitary gland, releases hormones into the circulatory system, and they go everywhere in the body. So they have to bind to particular receptors on the cells to have their effect. So the lining of the digestive tract is derived from what embryonic tissue layer? Endoderm. So think the digestive is inside, it's the gut. So endoderm is inside. It's also yellow in color when you look at it in the diagrams. Okay. Are there any questions about the review quiz? Okay. So we are going to finish on tissues today, and we are then going to start talking about cell reproduction. So we were talking about the different types of glands. This is an example of a unicellular gland. And mucin is actually a protein that is produced by the goblet cells, and when it's secreted, it combines with water to form mucus. And so you can see here in this diagram, the secretory vesicles would be produced by, the protein is produced by the RepR, and then you can see the vesicles, which are producing the mucin, would then come and release their products to the outside. So if it's releasing a protein and it's secreting it. Is that exocytosis or endocytosis? Exocytosis. So here you can see that this cell is like a factory, right? It has these ribosomes on the rough ER that is producing the protein mucin, and then it gets packaged into vesicles, and the vesicles are transported to the outside. And so this is where it's being released as mucin combining with water to form mucus, okay? And mucus has two major functions in the body: to capture stuff, and then also to protect the digestive tract from self-digestion. Okay. Now, some of our glands have ducts. And so, as I mentioned before, these would be exocrine glands, but these are multicellular glands. And so you notice that they do not consist of a single cell, but inside the duct, we have cells, and those cells can secrete substances. And so we talked about sweat, right? So sweat is an example of a gland that secretes its substances. Sweat's the not branch for, I don't remember which one it is. This one is an example. This is it, merocrine gland. So this would be your sweat gland, right? It's multicellular, and then it secretes its substances to the surface of the skin. We also have more complex, so you don't need to know all these names, right? You don't need to categorize them. All of these would be exocrine glands. So even the mammary glands have these lobules, these branches, and so the mammary glands would be specialized cells that secrete all the components of milk. And that is transported via a duct to the nipple, where the baby latches on and is able to get nutrition from that. So this just shows some different types of, this is also salivary gland right here. So some different types of glands that we see. Now I wanted to mention one particular organ that has both types of glands. And so this is the pancreas. So the pancreas has endocrine glands, and in the endocrine gland, it produces insulin. So insulin is really important because it regulates our blood glucose levels. And if your pancreas cannot produce insulin, then you have type 1 diabetes. So for example, some people are born, or as when they're children, with type 1 diabetes where the pancreas, the endocrine portion of it, is attacked by the immune system and is destroyed. And so then they have to take insulin during the rest of their life in order to help regulate their blood sugar levels. So as an exocrine gland, does anybody know what it produces?
Bicarbonate?
Yes. So it produces bicarbonate ions. And what that does is that actually helps to neutralize the pH of the stomach acid. So this is HC3O3 with a negative, right? So it combines with the hydrogen. So it's a neutralization. That's a hydrogen ion, okay? But what I was looking for also was enzymes. So these are transported via a duct to the small intestine. And the pancreas is a really weird organ because it is just this diffuse tissue that exists in the connective tissue around your stomach. It exists in a mesentery. So it's not like a solid organ. It's just like this, it almost looks like fat tissue, but it's just kind of like this diffuse glandular tissue that is surrounding the stomach and near the small intestine. So the pancreas has a dual function, both endocrine and exocrine function. Okay. We talked about, I talked about methods of secretion there, sorry. Okay, so that was epithelial tissue. So remember that glands are a type of epithelial tissue. The next type of tissue we're gonna talk about is connective tissue. And so connective tissue is characterized by cells within a matrix. Okay. So when we look at bone, which is a type of connective tissue, right, we have osteocytes. So think osteoporosis, for example. Osteo means bone, and anytime you see the site ending, that means that it is a cell, right? So the osteocytes sit in the matrix. So this is the cells, and the matrix includes collagen fibers plus calcium phosphate salts. Okay. So does anybody remember what type of molecule is a collagen fiber? Is it a protein, a carbohydrate, a nucleic acid, or a lipid? It's a protein. So the collagen fibers are structural proteins. Right? They are also organic. So this is the organic part of the matrix. The calcium phosphate salt, the minerals that are in our bone, are actually inorganic. So that's the inorganic part of the matrix. So it's kind of interesting. You can do this really cool experiment where you take chicken bones and you put them in vinegar, and then every day you replace the vinegar and you just let it sit for a couple of weeks in your refrigerator. And what happens is that the salts in the chicken bone get all dissolved by the acid in the vinegar. And what you're left with is it's an interesting bone. It's really pliable. So you can actually bend it like in half and it doesn't break. And so the collagen fibers actually add strength to the bone. The calcium phosphate salt makes it hard, right? So you can take away the hard and your bones get more soft, but they're also pliable. And so sometimes if calcium doesn't get put into the bones, in children, it can cause their bones to bend and you get this look where their legs are bow-legged. Does anybody know what that disease is called? Where kids, their bones don't develop and they're too soft and they become bow-legged is called? It is called rickets. And so rickets is a disease where, you don't need to know that for the midterm or anything, but the rickets is the disease where you don't have enough calcium phosphate salts, right? And it generally is due to a vitamin D deficiency, because vitamin D is necessary to absorb calcium. So that's why they put vitamin D in milk these days, right? So you get your vitamin D and your calcium together in your digestive system, and so that you can absorb the calcium. So it's not as common as it was previously before we added vitamin D, at least it's not common in the United States, it might be elsewhere, okay? So bones are examples of connective tissue. It's important to realize that blood is also an example of connective tissue, right? One reason why it is that it's produced by red bone marrow, right? So it's produced in the red bone marrow. So in the center of the bone, the red bone marrow is very abundant in children, but as we age, it gets replaced by yellow bone marrow, which is fat. But we do have some places where it is found, and one of them is in your hip joints. And so sometimes when you get a bone marrow transplant, they take the bone marrow out of your hip joint to put it into somebody else's. And the red bone marrow has stem cells. And these stem cells are unspecialized. And they can be useful because depending upon where you put them in the body, they could specialize into different things. But in the blood, they specialize into red blood cells. And why are red blood cells red? What is the pigment called? Hemoglobin, yeah. So it has hemoglobin in it, and hemoglobin binds oxygen, right? So hemoglobin transports oxygen, and the hemoglobin is found in our red blood cells. When we look at the other cells, we have white blood cells, right? These have an immune function. We actually looked at an example of when we watched that cell chase a bacteria in the video, right? And then it engulfed it via phagocytosis. So we have white blood cells that have an immune function. And then we have pieces of cells that are important in blood clotting. And these pieces of the cells are called platelets. So platelets are pieces of a larger cell. So pieces of cells, and they're important in blood clotting. So that's the cellular component of blood. Okay. We also have plasma. So I would say my plasma is my matrix, right? So this consists of water and solutes. So things that are in solution. So the solutes could include antibodies, they could include hormones, they could include clotting factors, right? So proteins that are going to come out of solution and help the platelets clot. So those are things that are in solution. Glucose is in solution. Cholesterol is actually in solution because it's actually transported, attached to a protein. And so even though cholesterol is a lipid, it goes into solution because it's attached to a protein. But that would be the matrix. So the plasma is the matrix of the blood. So from your lab, what was another example of connective tissue that we looked at?
Muscle tissue?
Connective tissue. Nobody remembers? How about adipose? Okay, so adipose, this is fat tissue. And this specifically stores triglycerides. Right? So remember, the triglycerides are where we store energy, and it can be used for energy, but it can also be used to cushion organs. So it cushions organs. And this is sometimes referred to as visceral fat. So if it's around your kidney, it is visceral fat. It also is insulation. So this tends to be what we call subcutaneous fat. Now, sometimes people store fat as visceral fat. So I think I might have mentioned this before, but if you have a big belly and it's hard on the outside, the fat is underneath the muscle, and the visceral fat is actually thought to be worse for you than subcutaneous fat. So men sometimes get beer bellies, sometimes women do too, but women tend to have more subcutaneous fat, which is right underneath the skin. So that would be adipose tissue. Another example of connective tissue that we looked at in lab is hyaline cartilage. So instead of osteocytes, cartilage has cells that are called chondrocytes. Chondro. Sharks are called chondrichthyes. Okay, so chondro means that it is from a cartilage. It is found in cartilage. And for example, the hyaline cartilage has only collagen fibers. So one of the things that's interesting is that our whole skeleton, most of our skeleton, starts out as hyaline cartilage. So like when you're in the uterus as a fetus, the fetal bones are like they have a humerus and they have a radius and ulna. They're all composed of hyaline cartilage. And then as they develop in the womb, that hyaline cartilage gets replaced with bone. And so bone is just taking that hyaline cartilage and ossifying it by adding minerals to it. So our bones embryonically start out as hyaline cartilage, but hyaline cartilage also protects the ends of bones. So it would be found in the embryonic skeleton. It protects the ends of bones. Sometimes when you get arthritis, the hyaline cartilage gets destroyed and then you have bone rubbing on bone, and that's a really bad thing, okay? And another place where it is found, it is the rings in the trachea. So I think most of the slides we looked at were actually tracheal, and then we saw that there was a ring of hyaline cartilage. Okay, so that is connective tissue. Okay, we also have tendons and ligaments. So tendons function to connect muscle to bone. So when the when the muscles contract, they can move the bone. And then we also have ligaments. And ligaments help to stabilize joints because they connect bone to bone. So some that you probably have heard about ligaments are in your knee. So if you have a knee injury, sometimes you cause the rupturing of the cruciate ligament. And so the cruciate ligament are these ligaments that cross in your knee joint like this, and they connect the femur to the tibia. And so if you get hit from the side, it can cause that cruciate ligament, specifically the anterior cruciate ligament, the ACL, to break off. And then you have to have surgery to repair it because ligaments and tendons specifically ligaments, they don't repair themselves very well. And so you have to have surgery to do that. Okay, so that would be examples of connective tissue. Okay, so the next type of tissue that we're going to talk about is muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is interesting because these are cells capable of contraction. Right? So muscle tissue itself pulls, it never pushes. So it pulls on bones, right? Or pulls. I'll just put pulls, skeletal muscle, pulls, it never pushes. Right. When it contracts, and I'll put this is skeletal muscle. So skeletal is just a type of muscle tissue, skeletal muscle. Okay. So we talked about 3 different types of muscle tissue. The smooth muscle is what we see in the blood vessels. And when the smooth muscle contracts, it can cause vasoconstriction. So the muscles are circular and they surround the blood vessel. So if I drew my blood vessel here, right, the contraction of the muscles actually will decrease the diameter of my blood vessel, right? So we can have what is called vasoconstriction of blood vessels. Right. And so when it relaxes, it vasodilates. So it makes it, this would be vasoconstriction, and this would be vasodilation. So when it relaxes, it's called vasodilation. And that helps to shunt blood to different parts of the body, right? So you can shunt blood to your brain, away from your skin, right? Where else is smooth muscle found besides blood vessels? Somebody said something. Here's an interesting one, your bladder. I just learned how the bladder worked. It's like, the bladder is really interesting one. So the bladder, when you feel like you have to go to the bathroom, that's the smooth muscle in your bladder contracting, trying to urinate. But we actually have conscious control of the sphincter, right? So we can keep from urinating, even though it feels like we have to. But the interesting thing about the bladder is that after a while, it will stop. You'll stop sensing it. Like, so you have to go to the bathroom, and then you're like, oh, maybe I don't. Right? And that's because if you don't void your bladder, it will stop contracting. But if it's still full, there's actually receptors that can detect that it's being stretched, right? And so it'll try again. And you're like, oh, I have to go to the bathroom again now. You know, it's like, oh, I don't, oh, I do, right? And that's just because of the smooth muscle contracting. And then when you don't go to the bathroom, it relaxes for a little bit. And then then it contracts again, right? So it just keeps reminding you that you need to go to the bathroom, okay? So that's the bladder. We also have it in the uterus. So during labor, those contractions that push the baby out, that is smooth muscle. We also have it in the digestive tract. So the digestive tract, once you swallow, you have no control over the movement of your food, right? So I swallow it and my esophagus will start contracting and forcing food down into my stomach. Then my stomach will start to contract, right, and churn the food. And then it will put the digestive juice into the small intestine. And so it's just kind of like this wave of contraction that moves everything, hopefully in one direction. Okay. So it's also found in the digestive system. Okay, so I mentioned skeletal muscle. Right? So this is what moves the bones. But it is also found in the diaphragm. What is the diaphragm part of? What system? Does anybody know? It's actually not digestive. I mean, it has sort of a digestive maybe kind of function, but what is it? Breathing, right? So the diaphragm, when I inhale, my diaphragm contracts and it creates bigger space in my lungs and the air automatically moves in. And then when I relax my diaphragm, I exhale, right? So the diaphragm is a respiratory muscle that aids in ventilating your lungs. The tongue is also skeletal muscle, right? It's kind of interesting. The tongue is able to like contract against itself to make your tongue thick or thin, right? And then it can move around and stay out of the way of your teeth when you're chewing, and you can use it to create sound and language, okay? So those are some examples of skeletal muscles, okay? Cardiac muscle, where is this found? Heart, right? Okay. It is very unique because, as you saw in the video, it can contract without the nervous system doing anything. So you could actually take a heart out of an organism like a turtle, and it will actually still beat, right, outside of the body. And so our hearts are not that resilient, but the hearts of some reptiles are that resilient. Okay. Not to say that our nervous system doesn't innervate our heart to either speed up or to slow down our heart rate. So if we look at the differences, I'm not going to make you memorize the differences for the midterm exam, right? But you saw the skeletal muscle is striated and it has multinuclei. So the nuclei here are on the outside of the kind of pushed out to the outside edges of the cell, okay? And then if you look at the smooth muscle, oops, the smooth muscle is sheets of single cells. So they tend to be spindle shaped, right? So they have a spindle shape to them and they only have one centrally located nucleus. And then the cardiac muscle is kind of interesting because it is striated, it has striations, and it's branched. And it can contract against itself because it's not contracting against muscles, it contracts against itself to propel blood through the vessels and carry it out to the body. Okay, so the last tissue is what is referred to as nervous tissue. So nervous tissue contains neurons. And these are specialized cells that release neurotransmitters. So those neurotransmitters would be secreted, and they are produced, they're proteins, like dopamine, for example, is a neurotransmitter that's produced by neurons in your central nervous system. Those are proteins that are produced at the rough ER, passed into vesicles, and then secreted when stimulated, when the neurons are stimulated. So they are factories as well, producing neurotransmitters. They also form connections with one another. And these are called synapses. Right? So there's spaces between neurons. There's generally chains of neurons. And the spaces between them are called the synapses. And that's where the neurotransmitters are released and kind of diffuse across and send a signal from one neuron to another neuron. Nervous tissue does not just exist of neurons, which is what I learned 20 years ago, but it also has what are called glial cells. And these are helper cells. So the glial cells actually outnumber the neurons in your nervous tissue. So for like every one neuron that you have in your nervous tissue, you have 10 glial cells. So they're actually more abundant. And they have a variety of functions. Different types of glial cells have different functions, but they're discovering that there might be super important. And they might actually hold the key to why people develop Alzheimer's, for example. And they're also important in producing your cerebrospinal fluid and circulating it and just keeping the neurons in a good environment, okay, so that they don't degenerate. Okay, so in your book, they show a picture of a neuron. So these are the neurons. They are rather large shaped and they have extensions. You don't need to know the names of the extensions, right? But this is called an axon, and it releases neurotransmitters. And if there's another neuron right here, that would be the space between the two neurons, which is called the synapses. Okay. All of these little dots, and we kind of talked about that, all these little dots surrounding the neurons, those are what the glial cells are. So they're really important. We don't quite understand all of their functions. Okay. So the last thing that we're going to talk about in chapter 6 is about tissue injury and repair. So when we injure tissue, so think, for example, if you fall down and you scrape your leg, right? We get what is called inflammation. And inflammation is a defense mechanism. So we think of inflammation as being really bad because sometimes it's chronic. So like if I get chronic inflammation in a joint, that could be bad overall, right? And I might want to take ibuprofen to decrease the inflammation. But inflammation in and of itself, if it's not chronic and long-term, is actually important defense, okay? And it protects us against infection. Okay, so one of the things that happens is that if we look at inflammation is that we get swelling. And swelling is due to the production and release of histamine. So damaged tissue causes histamine to be released by white blood cells. Okay. And what that does is it makes the capillaries, or the very thin blood vessels, it makes capillaries leaky. So what that means is that fluid from the capillaries moves into the tissues and it causes it to swell. And it helps to kind of flush out substances, but also because the capillaries are leaky, white blood cells get into the tissue, okay? So we would say that fluid and white blood cells get into the tissue. And the white blood cells are important in phagocytosis. And so this would be like eating bacteria. Okay, so that would be part of inflammation. Now, we also get blood clotting. So we'll put clotting here. Now, clotting is a tricky thing because we want the blood to clot in certain places, but if it clots inappropriately, it can be really bad, right? That's what causes strokes, for example, if it clots in blood vessels in your brain, heart attacks, if it clots in your blood vessels to your heart, right? So clotting is very tricky, and it involves platelets adhering to damaged vessels. Okay, so platelets adhere to damaged vessels. So the blood vessels have been damaged and you're starting to bleed, right? You want those blood vessels to stop bleeding. You don't want to, if it's a bad, like it's a bite wound and you're bleeding excessively, that would be bad, right?
What's missing then if they're hemophilic?
Okay, so we're getting to that.
Okay.
So also we have what are called clotting factors. And these come out of solution. So, and they form kind of a net to catch red blood cells. Okay, so the clotting factor that's important is called fibrinogen. So this is a clotting factor that we have in our blood. This is a protein, and it is a soluble protein. So it is soluble in water. But there are other clotting factors, and clotting is a really weird thing in that it involves like 13 or more different factors and enzymes, and it's called a cascade. Something starts it off, and then there's a cascade of events that occur. But ultimately, what it leads to is fibrinogen being converted to fibrin. So this is soluble in water, and this is insoluble. You will see inogen again. Anytime you see something with inogen at the end of it, that means it's inactive. So this is inactive clotting factor. It's just present in our blood. And then a series of chemical reactions will occur to change it from fibrinogen to fibrin. And this is active. Right. Okay. So this helps to prevent blood loss. Clotting does. Okay. So if we look at the scab, right? This is just a dried out blood clot. Right? So your scab that is formed is just like the clotting factors and the platelets and the red blood cells, they just kind of all dry out and you get a scab. Okay. So as your tissue underneath heals, it forms what is called granulation tissue. So granulation tissue is very vascular, so it has lots of blood supply. It is pink, and it is fragile relative to normal tissue, right? So everybody's picked a scab, right? And you're like, oh, I picked that scab too soon, right? Because it starts to bleed again. And when you look at underneath the scab, if it's pink and it starts to bleed again, that is the granulation tissue, okay? Once the granulation tissue then transforms into normal tissue and you have a scar, right? Then when the scab comes off, it's not pink anymore, right? So it looks normal, like normal tissue, okay? So we also can have, in some cases, scab formation. Let's see where my happened there. I don't know. Okay. So we have what is called scab formation, not scab formation. Oh, now I forgot what I was talking about. Scar formation. So scar tissue. Okay. So not always does scar tissue form, but if the damage is kind of extensive enough, scar tissue is white. And it contains collagen fibers that knit the wound together. Okay. So scar tissue is not flexible like other types of tissue. And so scar tissue, if you have like internal trauma, or if you've had a surgery, sometimes scar tissue can form inappropriately. And so sometimes they have to go and remove it. And sometimes it forms adhesions. So like my niece she was premature, and so parts of her intestine died. So they had to go in and remove parts of her intestine and put it back together. And then her intestine formed scar tissue and it started to adhere to itself, right? And so when you get adhesions, then you have to work on breaking up those adhesions. So this also sometimes forms adhesions. And that's why it's actually good if you have surgery, like abdominal surgery, and you have a scar, right? Is to rub it and to move it around and to like massage it. I had my cervical spine, I had a herniated disc, and so my neck has a plate in it. And so this, they said rub it, you don't want this big open incision here, right? So you want to rub it around so that the scar tissue doesn't form adhesions, okay? So if you look at a diagram from your book, okay, here is my wound. Here is my blood vessel. Here is the inflammatory chemicals. So part of the inflammatory chemicals would be histamine, which causes the blood vessels to dilate and to become leaky, and they release their substances out. This is a white blood cell that actually can leave the capillary and go out into the tissue and feed upon bacteria, okay? So this would also be a white blood cell, the macrophage up there, and the neutrophils down here. So to get the wound to knit together, we use collagen. So if you don't suture it, right? If you don't use, now it's what is the big thing? Just using super glue, right? So you don't super glue your incision together. You'll see that the collagen fibers actually kind of make the incision come together, okay? And then you get granulation tissue covering over, and that is very vascular. And then sometimes you can see underlying white underneath the skin, the normal healthy skin, and that's scar tissue that's been left over and hasn't been formed into the new tissue. So scar tissue isn't as flexible as healthy tissue. So you want to reduce the amount of scar tissue that's produced after an injury occurs. Okay. Any questions about that idea? Okay. So we're going to move on to chapter 7 today, kind of introduction to cell reproduction. So in chapter 7, we're going to start talking about how cells divide, what the genetic material is, and how do we pass our genetic material on to the next generation. So this is kind of the beginning of our discussion of genetics, which is kind of exciting. So when we look at the human life cycle, we have, like most animals, almost like all animals, we have the egg and the sperm. Okay. The egg and the sperm are what are referred to, and I'm going to put the nucleus in the sperm head too. These is not drawn to scale. The egg is much larger than the sperm. Okay. So these are called gametes. They come together to form a single cell. So they fuse, and the genetic material in the two nuclei come together, and they form what is called a zygote. That's a Z, zygote. So this is the same thing as the fertilized egg. So we all have started out as a single cell, as a fertilized egg, as a zygote. So at one point in time, we were all zygotes, okay? From here, the zygote is then going to undergo cell division. So we're gonna have this one cell, and it is going to divide into two identical cells, okay? So this type of cell division is called mitosis. Okay. And this is where the parent, they call it the parent cell. The parent cell divides and produces two identical daughter cells. And they could just as easily be called son cells, but daughter cells, okay? They just call them daughter cells. It doesn't mean that they're female, right? So this would be like during tissue repair, right? When your cells are trying to regenerate normal healthy tissue, this is what is happening as well, right? So we then have two cells, and then the life cycle is going to continue, right? Until we get like a multicellular embryo. So this would be my multicellular embryo right here. Okay. From the multicellular embryo, I'm just going to skip through because we're not going to talk too much about development. So this multicellular embryo is going to eventually produce a whole nother adult. Okay, all of that is mitosis. So mitosis includes growth, development, and repair. So this is all mitosis. Okay, so we go from a single cell to trillion cells using the process called mitosis. Okay. Now, when we go from an adult, in the adult, we have specialized cells which are called germline cells. So think about, that's a line. Think about that this is the lineage. This is your reproductive lineage. This is your passing on your genes, right? So the germline cells are cells that are going to give rise to the egg and the sperm. Okay, so in the male, the germ cells, the germline cells are found in the testes. In the female, it is in the ovaries. Okay, that's the only place you have cells that are designated as germline. Okay, so then these cells, these germline cells, are going to give rise to the gametes via another type of cell division, which is called meiosis. So meiosis only produces gametes. It doesn't produce regular body cells. It only occurs in the ovary and the testes, and it's the process by which these cells that have been selected, and it's kind of weird, but during embryonic development, cells migrate specifically into the ovary and the testes while you're an embryo. And those are the cells that are going to become egg and sperm and possibly become immortal. The rest of the cells in your body are going to die when you die. So these are special cells because they have the potential for immortality being passed on to the next generation. So in your book, they have a diagram that shows this with some more information, right? But it shows, it's actually drawn in the opposite way that I drew it, maybe. Oh no, yeah. Actually, it's the same way. Okay. So this is a diagram that shows chapter 7, right? Are we in chapter 7? I think so. Okay.
Yeah. But we don't see the diagram.
There it is, 230. 230.
Oops. Okay. So when we're talking about cell reproduction, we also have to talk about the genetic material and what the genetic material is doing when it goes from being one cell to two cells. So we talked about the genetic material and how in a eukaryotic cell, it's located in the nucleus, the vast majority of it, except for the mitochondria, DNA. And it consists of DNA wrapped around proteins that are called histone proteins. So histone proteins are associated with DNA. DNA is our genetic material, and it packages the DNA. So it wraps it around it. So this is packaging of the genetic material. So it packages DNA. Okay. Now, when it is loosely packaged, it is called chromatin. So it's loosely wrapped DNA. And this is in a non-dividing cell. So the DNA is loosely wrapped because it has to provide direction for the production of proteins, right? So it can't be like tightly wrapped because, and we'll talk about gene regulation, but if it's going to produce protein from the information in the DNA, it's got to be loosely wrapped, okay? So when a cell gets ready to divide, it produces chromosomes. So during the cell cycle, when a cell gets ready to divide, the chromosomes are tightly wrapped DNA. Oops, tightly wrapped DNA. And this, they show up or they occur prior to cell division. So they're found in cells preparing to reproduce or divide. Okay. So if we look at the typical shape of a chromosome, it looks something like this. Okay. So if we look at the shape, this center is actually more tightly wrapped, and this is what is called the centromere. So that just is more tightly wrapped DNA. The arms actually have a letter associated with them. This is the P arm, and this is the Q arm. So the P arm and the Q arm, sometimes the P arm is smaller, but we have kind of figured out exactly what our chromosomes look like, and so we know if they're upside down or right side up by the way that they stain, okay? So the very tips of the chromosomes have another name. Does anybody know what those are called? The very tips of your arms of the chromosome. This is what is referred to as a telomere. Right, that's a T, telomere. So telomere means at the end of. Centromere means in the center of. Now, this is a chromosome that has only one copy of each set of instructions or genes. And so I'm going to draw here, I'm going to say that right here is the gene A. Okay, so a gene is a piece of DNA that codes for a protein. So gene, that's just one of the many genes. You could have thousands of genes, tens of thousands of genes located along an example of a chromosome. Okay. So because there's only one gene, we say that this chromosome is an unreplicated chromosome because it has only one copy of each gene. It's unreplicated. So when we talk about DNA replicating, that means it's making an exact copy of all of the information. And so if I show you a chromosome, and you might have seen chromosomes that look like this, right? This is a replicated chromosome. So notice that it would have two copies of that gene A. Okay, so that's what's called a replicated chromosome. So you need to know the difference. Like if I do that, is that unreplicated or replicated? So you can say, oh, this one's replicated, that one's unreplicated. Okay. So these arms now have a name, and they like female names. And so these are called the sister chromatids. Has nothing to do with sex, but they use daughter and sister. So those are called chromatids. Let me write that bigger. Chromatids. Okay, so those are the sister chromatids. The process of making a replicated chromosome from an unreplicated chromosome is what is referred to as DNA synthesis. This is going from an unreplicated to a replicated chromosome. So in your book, they have pictures of the DNA molecule as it is wrapped around the histone proteins. And so this is a diagram. Would this be replicated or unreplicated? That one right there. Replicated, okay? So if I unwind it, it becomes chromatin. And if I look at what the chromatin is, chromatin consists of DNA wrapped around histone protein. So the blue part is the histone protein. The purple would be the DNA that is wrapped around it. Okay. Okay. So we could talk about the cell cycle, and this is like the life cycle of a cell. So this is the life cycle of a cell. So our cells, sometimes they become really specialized and they leave the life cycle, the cell cycle, and become specialized and never reproduce again. Some cells in our body, like stem cells, undergo reproduction quite frequently, right? So this is how the cell behaves in its cycle, okay? So it starts out where we go from one parent cell to the daughter cells. Okay. So this could be early on during embryonic development, right? And so I'm now going to follow this cell, this first one that I drew, this first daughter cell, through the cell cycle. So it's just divided. And so it is going to go into what is called growth 1, right? So it's just divided. Growth 1 is where new organelles and proteins are produced. Organelles and proteins are produced. Okay. Now this cell that we've just produced could then become specialized. And if it's specialized, it leaves the cycle and it goes to G sub 0. So G sub 0 is a non-dividing specialized cell. So let's say this is a neuron, like a neuron. So our neurons tend to be non-dividing and they tend to live rather long periods of time, right? And they make connections in our brain. So the first connection, the neuron develops and it stays there and it's not going to go through mitosis again. So it leaves the cell cycle and goes to G sub 0. This one is called G1. Okay, G1. Okay. If it is not leaving the cell cycle, it is going to continue and it is going to go through the S stage. And this is synthesis. So this is DNA replication. So the chromosomes become replicated in the S stage. So that's synthesis, S for synthesis, DNA synthesis, DNA replication. Okay. And then it is going to go into another growth phase called G2. So that's growth, G2. And G2 means that all the things that are necessary for cell division to occur are going to be formed. So we have molecules necessary for cell division. Produced. Okay. From G2, it could go to M. So M stands for mitosis. So this is mitosis that I just drew here, right? That's taking one parent cell and producing 2 identical daughter cells. So the G1, S, G2, and M are all part of the cell cycle. G sub 0 is if they leave the cell cycle at any given point in time. Okay. So if we look at a diagram in your book, okay, you can see G sub 0, right? It leaves the cell cycle, but that cell could be stimulated to reproduce and re-enter the cell cycle. Okay. S would be where our genetic material is being replicated. So this actually shows the amount of time. So notice that the actual cell division doesn't take place. It's a short period of time. G1 is probably the longest. S is the second to the longest, and then G sub 2 is the second to the shortest. And so that pie chart shows the amount of time that a cell, like in an embryo, would be spending in each of the different parts of the cell cycle. Okay, so next week we're going to talk about, on Monday, we're going to talk about more about mitosis and how we regulate the cell cycle.
So today's lecture and Mondays are going to be on the
Yes.
midterm also?
Yes.
Okay. Cool.